Hello there, my name is Solmaz, and you are listening to Tabling Thoughts podcast. In this podcast, I talk about my experiences as a relationship coach and psychotherapist. The little things that I noticed in my clients' day to day lives, which may affect the quality of their lives and relationships enormously, and for some reasons, they don't pay that much of attention to them. As I mentioned, I'm a relationship coach and I also practice as a psychotherapist in Ontario, Canada. In order to get more information about me, you may check my Instagram account, YouTube, or my other podcasts via the links in description. You're listening to the 39th episode of Tabling Thoughts podcast, which is the third part of the topic we are going to explore more about when closeness becomes codependence. Now that we have unpacked what closeness looks like and how it differs from codependence, I want us to go deeper because these patterns don't just appear out of nowhere. They are rooted in our psychology, in the families we grew up in the cultural scripts we inherited, and in the unspoken lessons about love that we have carried since childhood. Why do so many of us confuse love with sacrifice? Why do we keep showing up in relationships where we lose ourselves? Why does codependence, even though it drains us, feel so familiar? Sometimes even comforting. That's what this part is about understanding the roots. Because when we know why we fall into these patterns, we begin to see a way out. Now let's look at the psychological roots and why we fall into it. When we look at codependence, it's not enough to just point out what it looks like. We need to go deeper. We need to ask, why do we fall into it? Why do so many of us, especially those from immigrant families, women, or high achievers, slip into these patterns even when we know they hurt us? The truth is, codependence doesn't come from nowhere, it has roots. And those roots often stretch back into our earliest relationships. One of the biggest roots is attachment history. If you grew up in a home where love and attention were inconsistent, you may have developed what's called anxious attachment. Love feels uncertain, so you cling tighter to make sure it won't go away. As a child, maybe sometimes your parent was warm and loving, and other times they were distracted, critical, or absent. So you learn if I work harder for love, maybe it will stay. That belief follows you into adulthood. You become the partner who can't relax unless you're constantly proving your values. You become the friend who overgives to keep others close. You become the employee who never says no. Another attachment root is something called parentification. This is when, as a child, you were put in the role of caretaker for your parent, siblings, or even the whole household. Maybe your parent leaned on you emotionally, sharing their problems with you as if you were their therapist. Maybe you had to step up and raise your siblings because the adults weren't capable. Maybe you had to anticipate everyone's mood to avoid conflict. When that happens, you grow up believing that your worth comes from caretaking. You internalize the message that if I take care of others, I'm valuable. If I stop, I disappear. And so, as an adult, codependence feels natural. It feels like the role you have always played. Now let's talk about gender roles because they play a massive part in this dynamic. For many women, the social script is clear. Be nurturing, be selfless, put everyone else first. A good daughter sacrifices. A good wife stands behind her husband. A good mother erases herself for her children. These messages are everywhere and they set women up to confuse codependence with closeness. On the other hand, men are often socialized to suppress their own needs, to be stoic, to avoid vulnerability. This creates a dynamic where men may rely on women to carry the emotional labor, while women feel obligated to do so. Both sides feed into the cycle of codependence. Another root is the fear of abandonment. If you carry a deep belief that you are not lovable as you are, you may compensate by trying to be indispensable. You might become the fixer, the rescuer, the one who always says yes. Because in your mind, if you are indispensable, you cannot be left behind. If they need you, they won't abandon you. But what happens is, instead of building real closeness, you build a prison for yourself. You stay at the cost of your authenticity. They stay, but at the cost of your freedom. And here is something we don't talk about enough. Why codependence is seductive? Because it doesn't always feel bad. Sometimes being needed feels like being loved. When someone says, I can't do this without you, it feels like proof that you matter. When you are the one everyone turns to, it feels like validation. That little rush of importance can mask the reality that you are disappearing. It's comforting to believe that love equals being indispensable. But in truth, love should never cost you your sense of self. So let's tie this together. If you had anxious attachment, you might chase closeness in a way that erases your needs. If you were parentified, you might default to caretaking and mistake it for love. If you were raised with rigid gender roles, you might confuse sacrifice with worth. If you fear abandonment, you might try to be indispensable so no one leaves you. And if you find comfort in being needed, you might cling to codependence even though it drains you. This is why codependence is so common. Because for many of us, it's not just a behavior we picked up as adults. It's a survival strategy we learned in childhood. It's a role we were praised for. It's a mask we wore so long we forgot what our real face looked like. But here is the most important piece, my friends. Survival strategies are not the same as thriving strategies. What kept you safe as a child may be keeping you stuck as an adult. What felt like love back then may actually be a pattern of fear today. At the moment, you can look at your history and say, this is where we started. This is why I cling, why I rescue, why I disappear. But this is exactly the moment you begin to create change. Because awareness begins the cycle. Awareness opens the door to healthier closeness, the kind that nourishes you instead of draining you, the kind that frees you instead of trapping you, the kind that respects your boundaries instead of erasing them. In our next episode, we are going to shift from insight to action. So far, we have explored what closeness is, how codependence shows up, and the psychological roots that make it so common. Now it's time to talk about what we can actually do about it. In the next episode of Tabling Thoughts podcast, we will look at reflection questions that help you spot patterns in your own relationship. And we will break down practical steps to move toward healthier closeness. From setting boundaries without guilt to building self worth outside of being needed. to learning how to nurture intimacy without losing yourself along the way. So, till next episode and practical steps, take good care of yourself.